This weekend in Kabul, Taliban parades celebrated 5 years since the group recaptured the capital. They framed their reign as restored stability and an end to decades of war in Afghanistan. Critics call it gender apartheid. So who are the Taliban and what led to this moment? The Taliban rose in the 1990s out of the wreckage of a war against the Soviet Union. The Mujahadeen who fought the Soviets were armed and funded by the US, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. When the Soviets left, they turned on each other, and out of that chaos came the Taliban. By 1996, this group of all-male clerics and students ruled most of the country. Women who had made up of around 70% of teachers, half of university students in pre-1996 Kabul, and who had held the right to vote since 1964, were forced out of workspaces, schools and public life. Then came the 11th of September 2001, 9/11. The US invaded Afghanistan in what it called its war on terror, but it also sold the war as a mission to liberate women.
I'm Laura Bush, and I'm delivering this week's radio address to kick off a worldwide effort to focus on the brutality against women and children by the al-Qaeda terrorist network and the regime it supports in Afghanistan, the Taliban.
Foreign troops stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years. Women became members of parliament, judges and journalists for the first time in nearly a decade. But the gains were uneven. In much of the countryside, Afghans only knew the decades-long war as airstrikes, night raids and corruption. Afghan villages encountered predatory criminality and power abuses from soldiers, police, militias, through extortionate checkpoints, protection rackets, and warlords whom the US and NATO embraced for short-term military gains. Then, in 2020, Washington signed a withdrawal deal with the Taliban. The Afghan government was not in the room. In August 2021, the last foreign troops were chaotically evacuated. The government fell in days, and the Taliban returned to power. Much of the world then looked away. Aid was slashed and the economy collapsed. Women were pushed out of public life once again, with over 80 edicts restricting education, employment, travel without a male guardian, dress, and women's voices in public. While foreign governments have begun to quietly deal with the Taliban, it is with one primary pursuit in mind: the deportation of Afghans overseas. 5 years on from the Taliban takeover, are ordinary Afghans better or worse off than before? Joining me to shed light on this is Afghan human rights activist and visiting scholar at Oxford University, Shahrazad Akbar. Shahrazad, welcome to MEE Live. 5 years on from the Taliban takeover, talk us through what an ordinary day looks like now for a woman in Kabul and how different that is to 5 years ago.
Thank you for having me, Matilda. An ordinary day in the life of a woman in Afghanistan looks different and unlike a day in life for women anywhere else in the world, including other Islamic countries. So women in Afghanistan are confined to their homes. They are discouraged and restricted from leaving the house. Even in seeking urgent medical care, women need to be accompanied by a male family member, a mahram. And they need to be completely covered, head to toe. They have to cover half of their face. And unless they abide by these restrictions, they can be stopped by the morality police and they can be, threatened, lectured, their male family members called, at instances detained. Women have been denied urgent medical health care. They have been turned down by physicians and nurses because they weren't being accompanied by a mahram. So it's quite confined. Women cannot go to parks. Women cannot go to gyms. Women can't go to beauty salons. Beauty salons were closed to women. Women can't seek higher education, even as midwives and doctors, so that they can deliver services to other women. And girls as young as 11 are banned from going to school. So secondary school is closed to girls. So for millions of secondary school age girls, 11, 12, 13, 14 in Afghanistan, they're confined to their homes. And many of them are battling depression, anxiety. There's a widespread mental health crisis as a consequence of these restrictions on women's lives and freedoms, which are unlike anywhere else in the world.
You know how you said that women, they can't even train as midwives and health providers. Does that mean that that women have to see male health providers? And is that something that women in Afghanistan are comfortable or I suppose even culturally comfortable doing? Yeah.
Well, currently there are midwives and healthcare providers who are women, who are serving women, but the pipeline is closed in the sense that since December 2024, no longer women are allowed to train as midwives. Already Afghanistan is dealing with a shortage of female healthcare providers. So what this leads to is a gradual femicide because, of course, women in majority of Afghanistan, including in urban areas, won't be persuaded to go to a male doctor for delivery. It's something that's already was a challenge for us to get women to go and visit midwives in a clinic because this is such a private moment in that cultural context. So now our fear is that by banning medical education for women and girls, the doors are opening to a gradual femicide where women will die from very preventable illnesses or during delivery more because there aren't enough women to serve them. And Afghanistan already has one of the worst maternal health, maternal mortality statistics in the world.
Now, this picture you're painting, not allowed to go to beauty salons, no tertiary education. I can see that this is a really dramatic shift for women in, say, Kabul compared to under the Republic. Is this change to life felt by women all over Afghanistan, including in rural communities, or has the story sort of followed a different narrative?
Well, across Afghanistan, there was growing demand for education. So I think the issue that most Afghans now, including in rural Afghanistan, feel upset about is the restrictions on the right to education for women and girls. Because wherever I traveled during the Republic, including to rural Afghanistan, people would ask, top demands were schools for girls in our village and female teachers. There was this growing social acceptance and social aspiration to educate your daughters. So that has had an universal impact. Across Afghanistan, there is anger and there is resentment and there is disappointment with the Taliban because of access to education. The issue of access to healthcare as well impacts women regardless of where they live. So for instance, women, we have had cases where women in rural Afghanistan, because also, again, Afghanistan is a country of widows because we had 4 decades of conflict. A lot of the men died, particularly in rural areas. A lot of young men died because either they were serving as Republic soldiers or they were Taliban fighters. So you have these women, female-headed households that had more freedom before that have been now taken away because they need to have a male family member to accompany them, to do things that they used to do themselves. So we have had instances where we have recorded cases where women have gotten into these arguments with, let's say, a physician or a Taliban police when they are traveling or trying to access services saying, I don't have any living male family member who is of age that could accompany me. What do you want? What do you expect me to do? How do you expect me to live my life? So the consequences can be quite widespread in that context.
Now, the Taliban reject accusations of gender apartheid as Western propaganda. They say women's rights are protected within Sharia and Afghan tradition. They probably point out that critics like yourselves aren't inside Afghanistan as you speak. What is your response to that?
Well, the Taliban's restrictions on women's rights and lives has been repeatedly rejected and condemned as in contradiction with Islam by leaders of Islamic countries, by organization of Islamic countries, by Muslim scholars inside and outside Afghanistan. It's unlike anywhere else in the world, including Islamic countries, including countries we share borders with, including what's happening in Pakistan and Iran. So the extent of restrictions in Afghanistan is something that has been called out by Muslim leaders across the world. And I'm not an Islamic scholar, but I'm a Muslim woman, and I have been raised in a Muslim family. And Afghans have been Muslim for a very long time, 1,400 years. And so the Taliban did not bring Islam to Afghanistan. They are ruling in an Islamic country. And Muslims in this country, including Muslim women in this country, for them, their faiths are very important. For majority of Afghans, first of all, majority of them are Muslim. And then for majority of Afghans, faith is a very important aspect of their identity. They are practicing what you would call practicing Muslims. For these women, it's a double injustice because not only they're being deprived their fundamental rights, they're being deprived of their fundamental rights under the name of the same faith that they believe gives them dignity, gives them liberation, gives them rights. So it feels like double pain and double betrayal and double repression. And that's the conversations that we have with women inside Afghanistan. They say, I'm a Muslim woman. I know this is not Islamic. I know my daughter should be going to school, but she's sitting here crying every day because she's depressed, because she can't be educated like girls all over the world. How should I respond to her? And this is why also Taliban then do not allow religious scholars inside the country to contradict them. The price of contradiction is ending up in jail, while we know from the history of Prophet, the history of the kind of main rulers in Islam, throughout the history of Islam, you could object to a ruler. You could ask questions. In fact, people have stood up and asked questions from Prophet Muhammad and criticized him, and he would respond. But in Afghanistan right now, if you criticize the Taliban on their education policy, you could end up in jail. You could be sentenced to 10 years in prison. So that tells me things are not adding up.
Thank you for responding to that, Shahrazad. Now, looking beyond women for a moment, life under the Republic varied enormously. A young woman in Kabul had a very different experience from, say, a farmer in rural Helmand. How has Taliban rule impacted other demographics, such as rural poor, young men, ethnic minorities like the Hazara? Just talk us through the shifts that we have seen.
So one of the big shifts, of course, is the end to active violence, although unfortunately we still have incidents, just an attack on a school. So the violence overall, the levels of violence overall has reduced. And undeniable that gives people some breathing space, some ability to travel, to live with less anxiety about their day-to-day life. That's undeniable. Taliban were primarily responsible for the violence, but that violence has now ended, that daily violence, daily conflict. So that aspect, I think, mostly men can benefit from that. Because for women, streets remain unsafe. For women outside, still remains unsafe because of restrictions. In terms of other groups who continue to remain vulnerable or who experience more vulnerability, religious minority groups experience more vulnerability because the Taliban are creating a whole system of governance that's completely based on Hanafi jurisprudence and their own reading of Hanafi jurisprudence. So they have fired, dismissed judges and lawyers who are from different religious Muslims, different religious backgrounds. We have documented restrictions on the rights of Ismailis, which is another religious minority inside Afghanistan. So religious minorities are more vulnerable because they don't have the same levels of ability to express their religious beliefs and to exercise these religious beliefs. There's also forms of ethnic discrimination, and part of it is because of the makeup of the Taliban government. The Taliban government is primarily made up of the Taliban, former Taliban soldiers, and officials within the group, and they are primarily Pashtun, and they come from, they speak a certain language, they come from certain parts of the country, and this in itself means that there is less representation. There is some token representation, but generally there is less representation from other ethnic groups, and Afghanistan is very ethnically diverse. So there is another sense of alienation or exclusion that other different ethnic groups experience because they are not as reflected, even as men, in the composition of the government.
Now, something else we also hear a lot is the economic situation is dire. There's been economic collapse. There's a crisis in child malnutrition. How much of today's hardship is Taliban policy, and how much is caused by the West cutting aid and freezing the country's reserves?
There's a substantial decrease in development and aid to Afghanistan, absolutely, following the Taliban takeover. I think initially there was openness to have these conversations even with the Taliban, to continue, in addition to humanitarian aid, to continue some forms of development aid. But these forms of development aid were conditional on certain conditions. Like, you can't exclude women completely from public life. You can't expect us to bankroll schools for boys while there's no education for girls at the secondary level. Similarly for universities, etc. So there is life-saving essential assistance going on inside the country. The amount is reducing by the year, partly because of the general changes and the general reduction in global aid. changes in these countries. I know in the UK there has been a reduction on international aid. We know what's happening with the US and cutting life-saving aid from, USAID is gone now, for instance. So it's part of that global environment, politics as well. A part of it is specific to what's happening in Afghanistan and Taliban. The number of restrictions that they have imposed on the UN, for instance, this doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. Afghanistan is the only country in the world where female national staff are not allowed to go to work now. This is in direct contradiction to the UN Charter. So I'm amazed that UN is still delivering in Afghanistan when it's discriminating against its own female staff by not allowing them to come to office in compliance to Taliban policy. So this is a kind of, Taliban have had many opportunities to withdraw restrictions, to enable more assistance. However, we have seen a move on the opposite direction. Women can't run NGOs. Okay, the humanitarian organizations sort of made peace with that. Then they said female staff of humanitarian institutions cannot show up to work. The humanitarian organizations made adjustments to that, and Taliban just kept getting emboldened to the point where they're like, UN female staff, national staff cannot come to work. And that's how actually UN is operating in Afghanistan now, complying with this extreme gender, not segregation, but erasure of women, essentially, from the UN offices.
So do you then think that withholding aid and sanctioning Afghanistan in this way, do you actually think that this is appropriate, necessary pressure to get the Taliban to change its policy on certain aspects in this that you've just described?
There is no, I think humanitarian aid, and we have consistently said this, humanitarian aid to Afghanistan needs to be increased. People are in dire need. Babies should not be dying because we disagree with the Taliban. However, that aid should be monitored, how that's being spent, who is spending it. There should be accountability, there should be transparency, but it should be increased, not reduced. However, humanitarian aid is not sustainable, Matilda. No one aspires to wake up, go, and stand in a line to get some food. I have been a recipient of humanitarian aid. It's not a life that you want as a child. And so we need to move beyond humanitarian aid. For moving beyond humanitarian aid, rather than doing tricky under the table deals with the Taliban, the international community needs to put its terms clearly on the table, and the Taliban also need to move if they want something beyond humanitarian aid. It's a two-way relationship. In terms of sanctions, there aren't sanctions on Afghanistan as a country. There are sanctions on Taliban leaders. To what extent they are effective, it hasn't moved them much in terms of their policy, but there aren't sanctions on Afghanistan as a country itself. What needs to happen is, I think this conversation about less or more sanctions is unproductive. It's not moving us forward. What needs to happen is that we need the regional countries, Western countries, everyone who has a stake in Afghanistan is providing humanitarian assistance, wants to engage with the Taliban, etc., to come with a set of demands that they share and to have a principled engagement with the Taliban around those demands. What's happening right now is the Taliban is negotiating separately with China, who has different interests, separately with Iran, separately with Pakistan, separately with Germany, who is just interested in deporting, groups of brown men so that it can tell its own constituencies that we are firm on migration. And this has created room for Taliban to actually continue with their repressive policies, to deny women their fundamental rights, to not go back an inch when it comes to giving rights and freedoms to the population, while also getting its own way and getting further recognition and legitimacy. The only group that's winning is the Taliban. It's not the Western countries, it's not the regional countries, and it's certainly not the women and girls of Afghanistan.
Shahrazad Akbar, thank you so much for your time. I realised we used a little bit more of it than we said we would, but it was really, really interesting hearing everything you had to say. So that is Afghanistan, 5 years on from the Taliban takeover. And it is into that context that today Afghans who fled are being forced to return, not in the hundreds or thousands, but the millions. Since 2023, more than 5 million Afghans have been pushed back to their home country. UN experts have called the scale staggering. Pakistan and Iran have led this push. In Pakistan, Afghans have been sweepingly blamed for terrorism, crime and drugs. Iran alone expelled well over 1.5 million people last year in what the government called a national security purge fueled by the US and Israeli war. Many of those expelled had lived abroad for decades. Some had never set foot in Afghanistan at all. This is one of the largest forced movements of people anywhere in the world today, and it is unique in that those involved are not fleeing a humanitarian crisis zone, but being driven back into it. The West is part of this too. The United States has ended protections, even freezing visas for Afghans who once helped its own forces. Germany has restarted deportation flights to Kabul, and to make those flights happen, European governments are now doing something they long refused to do, dealing directly with the Taliban. Rights groups say this breaks a basic rule of international law. You cannot send people back to face persecution. Governments say they are only removing criminals and failed asylum seekers. My next guest knows this story from the inside. He fled Afghanistan as a boy. He faced repeat deportation on his journey, and he kept fleeing all over again. Gulwali Pasali, thank you for joining us. You fled Afghanistan with your brother as a child during the US occupation. Why did you leave?
Sure. So I was fleeing mainly because of the foreign occupation in the US forces, because my family members were killed by the Americans. And also the Taliban were pursuing my family to join them, me and my brother at a very young age, 10, 11, 12. So there was two sides. So whenever I tell my story, people think I was fleeing the Taliban. I wasn't specifically fleeing the Taliban as such. In fact, my family, we were very sympathetic to the Taliban and their cause. And because there was no way to get justice from the family members who were murdered by the US forces. So I was very keen to join the insurgent group and to join. But when I was a child, my family decided for me, my mother and my grandmother and uncles and relatives, to send me and my brother away, to not be involved in this game of with the Afghan government, with the Taliban, because we were very keen to be working with the Taliban. But then that could have cost us our lives, or we could have killed people in the process. And particularly, my mother didn't see violence being the answer. So she sent us away for our safety. She saved us, but she also lost us.
Now, in your efforts to seek sanctuary in Europe, you faced deportation 2 times, and each time you reattempted that journey. Once you were deported to Turkey, another time to Iran, where you were due to be deported to Afghanistan before you escaped. What was it like to face the prospect of being sent back to the country you had run from? And why did this fail to deter you from doing it all over again?
It was very, very frustrating. I was looking for safety and security, and they were sending me back. Not only was the sending back dangerous itself, but also the journey itself was dangerous. I didn't understand the logic behind being deported as a child. I was without my brother, and there was also implications of us and my family's situation with the Taliban as well as the US forces. So I didn't have much of options, and I did what I thought was a rational thing to do.
Now, 5 million Afghans have been returned in the past few years directly to the same Taliban rule that many fled. What are the dangers that they may face on return today?
Hilda, people don't leave for no reason. People leave in the first place because their life is in danger or they don't have hope. Unfortunately, in the case of Afghanistan, about 10 million Afghans have fled the country in the last 5 years or so. So I have this very conflicting perspectives. One is that I'm happy the foreign forces are not in Afghanistan because, they killed my family members, they killed thousands and thousands of Afghans, and they were killing people for fun. But at the same time, I understand, I'm a refugee rights campaigner, and I understand when people are forced to flee. The dangers are many for Afghans when they return back, to settle into society, particularly some Afghans who lived in Pakistan and Iran for literally all their lives. They're Afghans who were born in these countries and have been sent back. When it comes to people's rights and people wanting to make their voice heard and care about women's rights and women's issues, which most of us do, then that's, especially if you have daughters or sisters who you want to go to school or become educated. There's just so many issues. But the main issue I felt, I went back to Afghanistan after 15 years, was the real struggle for people to feed their families. Literally, the economic situation was very dire.
Is there not also a risk of direct repercussions from the Taliban for people who fled the Taliban specifically?
Possibly people will be at risk for just for leaving because the Taliban knows people left because of them. So when they return back, it's kind of a strange situation where you left because of these people. But again, depends who is returning and from where. There will always be risks because there will be repercussions, not just like by a state level, not by like an establishment level, but individual groups, because the Taliban's are made up of groups and warlords, individuals, and people who will have enmity and problems in the past. So sadly, a lot of Afghan security forces have been killed. And then the Taliban just said, oh, although we have, like, they have a general amnesty for everyone, but, oh, it was a personal matter. But actually, it's not a personal matter. You kill security forces, you know. And so there's been so many reports by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by other human rights organizations to suggest of how people have been targeted for their previous work in the Republic.
Western governments spent 20 years fighting the Taliban. Now they are signing deportation deals with them. What do you make of that?
I mean, I wouldn't have an issue with them sitting down with the Taliban to discuss issues and find solutions, but not deportation. I think that's the Western government knows this is the best. This is something that the public will get behind, which is unfortunate. If they were to make diplomatic deals or to make economic deals or trade deals, then that would be, you know, big issues. But if they make deportation deal, the public wouldn't be protesting. Most people wouldn't be protesting, sadly. So again, that just shows you the Western hypocrisy. This idea they care about women's rights. I mean, they were spending billions and trillions in Afghanistan. And then now the UN is asking for like 5 billion a year to support families and children. You know, in the first 6 months of the Taliban took over, 13,000 children died because of lack of malnutrition. And the West, they were pledging conferences, humanitarian conference for Afghanistan. It didn't even pledge half of the 5 billion. So the struggle is real, particularly in winters. And also in summers, Afghanistan is experiencing droughts as we are in England. Afghanistan is very much impacted by climate change and global warming. We have the worst droughts, we have the worst flooding, the worst earthquakes in the last like 37 years. But very little attention is paid to it. So Western government, they like to make these deals on deportation, and the Taliban are keen to be seen as legitimate. I think this is the way to legitimize them. This idea to send people back, especially those who are fleeing from the Taliban, is very immoral and cruel.
Gulwali, you point out that the public would likely get behind this. Deportation goes hand in hand with political attitudes, political rhetoric in those countries that are doing the deporting. Now, often this means scapegoating, it means fear-mongering, it means racism. Talk us through the treatment that Afghans are increasingly facing in countries of asylum, whether that's Iran or Pakistan or in European countries.
There's definitely, as I mentioned earlier, like Iran, I feel very bad for what happened to Iran, the attack by the US and Israel. But there were some Afghans who were very happy because of the experiences, the racism and discrimination they had experienced in Iran. And there were some cities, some places which says Afghans are forbidden to enter. They asked bakeries not to sell breads to Afghans. It's just so inhumane. And same with Iran, like Pakistan, similar situation when it comes to people's rights. People had to leave behind their homes, their businesses and everything, literally. But in Europe, this idea, like when an Afghan commits a crime, for example, it doesn't mean all Afghans are criminal, but some public, the right-wing public or the anti-refugee and anti-migrant brigades, they will take this on to say, look, Afghans are criminals. I mean, you saw Najaf Farid saying Afghans are goat herders. I mean, I was a shepherd, so what? And I mean, they started with like foreign criminals and then failed asylum seekers, but I wouldn't be surprised if they sent, quite a large numbers of people. This has always been their plan from the start, like to send like at least 100,000 Afghans back.
I want to get your thoughts on something. So the Trump administration ended temporary protected status for Afghans just as it launched a war on Iran that triggered a huge escalation in the forced returns of Afghans from Iran. Now, Iran justified this mass deportation, which even included Afghans who had valid documents, by saying it was necessary national wartime security. So basically, Trump closed borders to refugees and then launched a regional war that created loads of refugees. Why is it that the same political groups advocating for mass deportation and closed borders are also typically the ones supporting war, intervention, and other root causes of mass migration?
That's not surprising. Like when in the UK, the right-wingers, or in the US particularly, they're like, oh, we don't want refugees, we want to deport people. Fair enough, and then they start wars. But then what happens as a result of wars? People will be displaced. People will have to move for safety. Actually, just 2 days ago, I met a young Afghan working in a restaurant in Tirana. He's been stuck here with his family for 5 years. He was meant to go to the US. Everything was done. He was evacuated from Afghanistan to Albania, and he said there's so many Afghans who are stuck here. The Afghans who are stuck in Dubai, in Qatar, in other places in the world, in Pakistan particularly, and other places who have US visas, but then everything is kind of revoked by Trump. So Trump, doesn't like refugees and migrants, but he likes to create them. And same with this is a Western concept, this Western idea that, we like to start wars, but we don't want to deal with the consequences of it.
And finally, Gulwali, what would a fair and humane policy look like in your eyes?
Like for me, the humane and compassionate policy would be to base it on treating people with dignity and base it on people's needs. We should do everything we can where people doesn't have to be forced to flee. When they do flee, then we need to be compassionate and kind and respond to it in the humane way possible. I mean, I'm not asking for some sort of special treatments. Let's treat people with common decency. Like these Afghans, refugees from elsewhere in the world, Syria, Iraq, and Somalia, Sudan, and so on. We just got to be, showing them, treating them with dignity and showing them kindness.
Gulwali Pasale, thank you for your time.